Hello and welcome. I'm Hania Salah, Director of the Columbia Global Center in Amman, and I'm pleased to have you with us for this discussion titled "A System Under Strain: Can Refugee Protection Keep Pace with Global Displacement?" This event is part of a year-long initiative convened by Columbia Global. The series brings together scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and students to examine the evolving realities of displacement, emerging policy responses, and the future of global protection frameworks. Across the world, and particularly here in our region, displacement has become an increasingly protracted and complex reality. Countries like Jordan have for decades been places of refuge for people from Palestine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, and more. In Lebanon, Syrian refugees have been hosted alongside long-standing Palestinian communities. Today, the ongoing war, widespread internal displacement, and deteriorating economic conditions, including rising inflation and energy costs, have added further strain on an already fragile context. These point to the same underlying challenge, a region where displacement is outpacing the systems designed to respond to it. This year, in fact, marks the 75th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention, the foundational international framework that defines refugee protection and the basic principles of responsibility. It is against this backdrop that today's conversation becomes especially important. Jordan and Lebanon offer a lens into how this framework functions in practice. While neither country is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, both have developed adaptive approaches to hosting large refugee populations. In this webinar, we will shed light on the realities of contemporary displacement. We will hear from our panelists on how Jordan and Lebanon have engaged with the international refugee regime, including the pragmatic policy arrangements they have adopted. The panelists will also reflect on the role of international and multi-sector partnerships and what more sustainable, forward-looking models might look like. Since its establishment in 2009, our center provides a regional base for scholarly activities throughout the Middle East and strengthens Columbia University's academic partnerships and programs. This event reflects that commitment, bringing together knowledge and practical experience. Before we begin, I would also like to warmly acknowledge our colleagues and students joining us from our watch events on campus with Professors Claire Green and Catherine Spellman-Poots. We are also fortunate to be joined today by our panel of experts. Moderating today's conversation is Elora Mukherjee, the Jerome L. Green Clinical Professor of Law and Director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School. She is a globally recognized advocate for immigrants, asylum seekers, and unaccompanied children. Elora has been at the forefront of efforts to challenge detention practices and advance the rights of vulnerable populations. Joining her are Lina Abu Habib, the director of the Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship at the American University of Beirut. With decades of experience across the region, her work focuses on gender, forced migration, and civil society, and she brings deep expertise at the intersection of research, policy, and advocacy. Mariam Abu Samra is the head of the Renaissance Strategic Center at the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. Her work focuses on forced migration, refugee governance, feminist and decolonial thought in the Arab region, with a strong emphasis on linking academic research to policy and practice. Mariam contributes on issues of displacement, justice, and social transformation. Rana Kseifi is the Assistant Representative for Protection at UNHCR Jordan. She brings over 20 years of international experience. She has been part of emergency protection responses during the Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Mediterranean crises. Rana was deployed to Turkey and Colombia to support host governments during emergencies and in Washington, D.C., covering the Venezuela crisis. We look forward to a rich discussion that will help us better understand how refugee protection can evolve to meet today's realities. After the discussion, we will have time for Q&A, and we encourage you to share your questions. Thank you once again for joining us, and I will now hand over to Elora to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much, Hania, and thank you so much for everyone at Columbia Global Centers for organizing this event and inviting me to participate with this amazing group of panelists. So each panelist will have about 10 minutes to share their remarks. I'll be asking each panelist two questions, and let's start with you, Rana. So, Rana, I'd love to hear from you. To what extent does the 1951 Refugee Convention still address situations of protracted displacement, including large-scale internal displacement? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, how do non-signatory states shape the international refugee protection regime in practice? And what lessons can be drawn from the Middle Eastern, North African region's approach to hosting refugees while balancing national priorities and limited resources?
Thank you, Elora, and good morning or good evening, depending on where you are situated in the world. Thanks a lot for the first question. As Hania mentioned, this July will mark the 75th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. I don't want to go into a theoretical explanation. I'm sure most of you are very well aware of it. After the World War II events, we had about 50 million forcibly displaced persons in Europe. And so this convention came into essence and was established. And it was the first convention that actually gave an actual definition and a Bill of Rights to those forcibly displaced persons. 75 years later, and unfortunately, we have about 117 million forcibly displaced persons throughout the world. I think about 48 million of those are refugees and asylum seekers, 67 million are internally displaced persons, and about 4.5 are stateless persons. So the numbers speak for themselves. It shows that the situation that we were dealing with as the international community, as the governments, as the refugees in post-World War II are very similar. And that's simply because wars continue to happen. Discrimination and fear of persecution based on any of the 5 different grounds outlined in the convention is still very much evident today as it was in the past. When the convention was established, it had a geographical and a time bound to it, right? It was for Europe and for events that happened pre-1951. The 1967 protocol came into play to say, okay, the situation is not getting any better. So they removed. And thankfully, they removed it because now the world's worst crises are all over, including Europe. So I think today, the question that you raise is very good. Is it still relevant? It is. It is. And the 117 million forcibly displaced persons are facing this reality every single day. So I don't think it's a matter of relevance at the moment. I don't think it's a matter of reopening or revisiting the convention. I think it's a matter of enhancing or re-enhancing or renewing the commitment, renewing the political commitment of the different states, whether they're signatories to the convention, and we'll talk in a minute about those who are not signatories. So renewing their political commitment to uphold the different articles in the convention and provide rights and responsibilities and assistance to those forcibly displaced. I think it's a matter of increased political cooperation, and it's a matter of consistent implementation. And what I mean by consistent implementation is that we are facing, as the UN agencies and our partners, whether local NGOs or international NGOs, a financial crisis at the moment. The funding that donors have been providing, whether it was for emergency situations or protracted situations, has been declining. And so we cannot continue to service and to assist forcibly displaced persons being so dependent on funding without it being provided to different stakeholders in a more consistent manner. So in short, yes, I believe it's still very relevant, even for IDPs. The convention doesn't relate to IDPs, and there's no convention for IDPs, but there are different. There's the UN guiding principles on IDPs, and there's the interagency standing committee guiding principles. And UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has a lot of experience because ultimately a refugee and an internally displaced person is more or less the same. One has crossed an international border, the other has remained inside their country. But they all require access to rights, access to basic services, the right to some kind of self-reliance to be able to rebuild their lives until the time comes when they're able to either go back to their home country in safety and in dignity, or completely integrate in the country where they have sought asylum, or maybe a third durable solution, which is going on to a resettlement country. And all of these durable solutions requires commitments from the international community. So the convention is there, it's a good framework, but the commitment needs to be re-enhanced. And as UNHCR, we are going to spend the rest of this year working with different stakeholders to kind of build onto the 75th anniversary. It's not one of the good anniversaries. We wish that we wouldn't be, but unfortunately the global state of affairs speaks differently. By early 2027, we are hoping to publish a new agenda for the future of protection and solutions. And this is where we're really hoping to have a stronger commitment and cooperation of the different stakeholders. Now, let's move on to the second question. And this is where, what does it look like when governments like Jordan and Lebanon, and many other governments, by the way, in the Middle East and North Africa who are not signatories to the convention, what does it look like? How do they provide assistance and support? Let's take Jordan as an example. At the peak of the Syria crisis, they hosted over 700,000 Syrian refugees. And those were individuals registered with UNHCR. There could be more. And this is a country that has a population of 9.5 million. If you look at Lebanon, a country that has a population of 6 million, much smaller, and this 6 million is on the larger end of the spectrum, it hosted over 1.2 million Syrian refugees at the time. This is not the first time that Jordan hosts this many refugees. Prior to that, we had the Iraq crisis, and prior to that, we also had refugees from Somalia and from Sudan. And of course, prior to that, we had the Palestine refugees. The government is not a signatory. However, if I take the Syria crisis as an example, they established an entire directorate under the Ministry of Interior called the Syrian Refugee Affairs Directorate that specifies in collaborating with UNHCR and other UN agencies and other partners to provide assistance, support, and protection to Syrian refugees. The government was involved in the registration of refugees alongside UNHCR. And after registration, which by the way included biometrics. So we're talking also here top of the line kind of registration, and the biometrics, the iris scanning component brings in a lot of oversight for integrity and data protection, both for the refugee themselves and for the government. Once these individuals were registered, they were provided a service card issued by the Ministry of Interior, and this service card allowed them access to public health services, the public schooling system, which means that children were able to access school. And this was also in lines with His Majesty's statement that he did several years ago about leaving no child behind when it comes to education. So you look at access to services, access to territory, and the government of Jordan in most of the times really did uphold the principle of non-refoulement, which means not forcibly sending somebody back to their country of origin. And after the change of the government in Syria in December 2024, we still don't have a government that is pushing for refugees to go back. They openly say we encourage Syrian refugees to go back, but voluntarily. And this is very much in lines with international standards. Now, it's not a rosy picture for everybody. I'm not saying this to insinuate that refugees did not have a difficult time or are still not having a difficult time. They still need access to work and consistent work and legal work and rights and services. They still have to, carry the burdens of everyday life, just like the majority of the Jordanians do. But when you look at a country that has a high unemployment rate of its own nationals, and you see that some, in reality, in theory, refugees who obtain a work permit are entitled to work. So the access to work is there. The problem is with the covering the fees of this work permit. So you have access to public health. You have access to education. You have access to work permit. 80% of those refugees in Jordan live outside of camps. So there's freedom of movement. And even those inside camps, if they obtain certain permits, they will be allowed in and out of the camps. So they are upholding the spirit and the essence of the convention. What we need more of is more support to governments like Jordan, more international community support to share the responsibility. And when we have wars And I totally understand when states' agendas change and now have to focus on national security, and the socioeconomic political situation in MENA takes precedence at the moment over the refugee situation. But this is where the continuous support of the international community and its responsibility sharing really needs to come into play, and to allow refugees to maintain their presence in Jordan until they genuinely feel that it's safe for them to go back to Syria. So we still have a lot of challenges. UNHCR still requires the financial support of donors in order to be able to continue supporting the government and supporting the host community and the refugees. But I think when you look at some of the examples I've just shared, it really showcases a genuine access to services and basic rights, with all the challenges that both or all the stakeholders are facing. Let me stop here, Elora, just conscious of the time, and I'm happy to elaborate further. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Rana, for sharing all those insights. Now I'd love to bring Mariam into the conversation. Mariam, two questions for you. First, how should humanitarian and development actors adapt when displacement shifts from an emergency response to a long-term reality? And second, what responsibilities should the international community assume to ensure more predictable and equitable burden sharing when displacement becomes protracted? Mariam, can you please unmute? Thank you.
I'm sorry for that. First of all, thank you, Elora, and thank you, the Global Columbia Center, for having me and for hosting this very important panel on topic that is fundamental, especially in our region, but that is of interest for all international stakeholders, as also your question are anticipating. Thank you, Rana, for introducing very well the situation in Jordan and the framework under which we try to operate. So to address the questions that you asked, what and how should the humanitarian and development actor adapt to the protracted crisis or a refugee crisis. Yes, this is a fundamental issue, especially in Jordan, because when displacement becomes protracted, the response cannot remain organized around emergency logic alone. So humanitarian relief is still necessary, of course, especially during moments of renewed conflict or new arrivals or funding shocks, as we have seen also in the recent period. But once displacement lasts for decades or even more, the challenge is no longer only humanitarian. It becomes a social and economic and political and institutional issues. And Jordan knows it very well because, as Ran has already anticipated, Jordan has been hosting refugees for decades, and Jordan has seen, has been a host country and has seen, waves of refugee crisis, since 1948 with different kind of crisis happening. So at the moment, Jordan hosts one of the highest number of refugees per capita in the world, with the majority of them living outside camps and staying in urban areas and in host communities. And this is actually very important. More than 80% of the Syrian refugees, which are the largest refugee population at the moment in Jordan, live in cities and towns rather than in camps, as I was just saying, which means that displacement and the condition of refugees is no longer primarily a camp management issue. It is actually a question of daily life in the schools, housing, healthcare, labor markets, access to to water, access to services, access to, administrative and social services, as also Rana has mentioned. So exactly because of this reason, exactly because, the displacement in a protracted situation ends up, burdening or, impacting on the access to all these issues, the response must shift from parallel humanitarian systems towards strengthening national and local systems that can serve both refugees and host communities. So in protracted situation, it is not sustainable to maintain, just a system where, refugees are addressed separately, and therefore we try to face the crisis, providing in the emergency, in the immediate emergency, schools for the camps or clinics for the camps. But actually, it is much more important at this point, in a protracted situation, to develop a sustainable approach that invests in the public system that supports everyone. So Jordan itself has actually increasingly moved in this direction through the Jordan Response Plan and to the Jordan Compacts, both of which attempted to frame displacement not only as a humanitarian crisis, but also as a development challenge that required investments in infrastructure, in jobs, in municipal services, and host communities. The Jordan Compact, for example, tried to connect refugee livelihood to broader economic development and trade access and a framework that would include the host community. At the same time, Jordan's experience also shows the limitation of responses that remain too top-down or too externally designed. So while international frameworks often speak about the resilience and the burden sharing, local actors frequently remain underfunded and excluded from decision making in this shift that is required in order to make protracted displacement sustainable and in order to guarantee a dignified life and access to services to the refugees. So what we see is that in very often the response is driven by the intervention of international organization or international stakeholders, but in practice municipalities and local NGOs or even refugee-led organizations, women groups, schools, clinics and so on are the actors that actually have to carry the response every day, because they are on the ground and at the same time, they don't have enough resources to do so. So reports on humanitarian leadership in Jordan have actually noted that the response remain usually heavily dominated by international agency, even though these local organizations are trying to, are much more into the grassroots work that needs to understand what are the legal and social barriers that refugees have to face. So Sorry? Can I continue?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure where that noise came from.
That's fine. So no, what I wanted to say is that in this situation, therefore, localization becomes essential. So localization should not simply mean asking local organizations to implement, projects that are designed without, their contribution. Localization should actually mean shifting resources, authority, and also, the agenda setting, the decision making towards national and local actors in cooperation with international stakeholders. So in long-term displacement settings, local actors are actually not just second partners, but they should be empowered in order to actually participate and take the lead in reorganizing the response from an emergency situation into a long-term development approach. So, and this is something that we have experienced on the ground as a local organization where we actually faced, the difficulties of addressing the different issues in terms of legal aid, for example, or even access to services, social protection, and so on, by the refugee community. We actually, the organization on the ground actually understand that these challenges the refugee face cannot be separated from broader questions of right, legal status, and institutional access at the national level. So a second important adaptation is that humanitarian and development actors needs to also to think in area-based framework rather than population-based terms. And this goes with the localization points. What does this mean? It means that the relevant question that needs to be addressed is not what do refugees need, but what does this municipality, this neighborhood, this community, or this governorate need in order to absorb long-term displacement friendly and sustainability within sustainability. So in northern Jordan, for example, we know that there is a lot of pressure because the resource situation of water condition, for example, or electricity or housing. These are all issues that the refugee community is facing, but that also the local population, the host community is facing. So in a condition of protracted refugee crisis, a response can not only target the refugee population, but it should address these issues as structural, and therefore envision a response that is able to support the development of the infrastructure, of services, so that it can strengthen the host community and the refugee population within the host community. So finally, humanitarian and development actors need to adopt a broader understanding of protection. This is also very important. Protection is not just about the emergency assistance or non-refoulement. In protracted situation, protection also means access to documentation, to legal status, to work rights, to education, to mobility, and so on. And so this also needs to be understood, and policies that can address this kind of needs in a protracted situation of displacement needs to be developed, along with the empowerment of the local organization and an approach that focuses on infrastructure and development of services for the overall population. This also builds in, goes into the second question that you were asking, Elora, which is what kind of responsibilities the international community should assume in this kind of situation. Well, the first point that I need to emphasize in this sense, building on what I just said and the support that a host country will need in facing a protracted condition of displacement, is that protracted displacement is it shouldn't be just a humanitarian issues for the host country, but it is an international political responsibility. So we know that at the moment, today in the contemporary era, the overwhelming majority of the refugees are hosted in neighboring countries, which are usually low or middle income countries. Jordan is, of course, one of the clearest example of this imbalancement of host capacity. Jordan is a country that has limited natural resources, and it has high unemployment and also debt pressure. It has resource issues, above all, water scarcities. But despite all these challenges, Jordan is one one of the is a country with the largest refugee population per capita, just as I was mentioning at the beginning. So this means that the current system of support for refugees is unequally shared, and local communities carry actually the social, political, and economic weight of or pressure, let's say, of supporting and hosting this, the refugee population, and the international community, the wealthier countries often contribute financially, but it's still too little. It's still, very conditional also, and it's still, very unpredictable, as the last events have showed over the previous months. And funds remain a big issue, just as Rana was also mentioning, in supporting the fundamental work of institutions like UNHCR. So the first responsibility of the international community is that of making burden sharing predictable rather than discretionary, as we are seeing. And support for refugee hosting countries cannot depend on donor fatigue or just media attention and changing political priorities according to the different donors. If displacement is long-term, then financial support must also become a long-term commitment, and it must be predictable. It must be assured. Host country have,
Thank you. Mariam, thank you so much for sharing all of those insights. I just want to make sure that we have time to bring Lena into the conversation as well. So as you're talking about burden sharing and how can responsibilities be allocated equally or more equitably, I want to bring Lena in. So Lena, from your perspective, how can partnerships between academia, civil society, governments, and the private sector translate into tangible, sustainable solutions that strengthen refugee protection and service delivery? That's the first question I'd love for you to address. The second question is, how can refugees be reframed as contributors and resources rather than solely as recipients of services? And thank you to everyone who has already put questions in the Q&A. Others, you should feel free to chime in. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Elora, and thank you to the other colleagues. I will try to be brief to leave some time for the Q&A, and I will link the two questions together, Elora, if you don't mind. But actually, to talk about, how can we think towards solution, I thought I wanted to start with a few comments on what we have to deal right now and to deal with right now. And my comments are connected very much to the lived experience in Lebanon, be it at the level of internal displacement. And as we're speaking right now, we do have, since for a bit more than a month, something like 20% of the population internally displaced, with very poor prospects of whether to ever go back, given the destruction by the Israeli army of large parts of Lebanon, but also the internal displacement during the period of the civil war. And we know that until now, this has never been resolved. And of course, the situation of Syrian refugees and also Palestinian refugees. So whereas I think it's quite wrong to think about refugees and people who are displaced as a homogeneous group with a single narrative, I think the first issue, the first problem, the first challenge we look at is how to actually deconstruct. This is not one large community made of different nationalities. These are different communities with power relations within them. And to lump everybody into one group with a one-size-fits-all solution is actually what people have been dealing with until now, and even as we talk. And I think the second major problem is that this has always been a very extractive situation. Mariam talked about localization. I want to push it even further. every single situation with any moment in history where you had massive displacement, forced displacement, and refugees moving and forced mobility, we have had various level of extractive situation, being at the level of, and I really want to put it out there, extractive colonial research, and I really want to put it out there about the number of scholars who have made their names and their reputations out of extractive research from refugees in the global south, and particularly from Lebanon, and the economy that it generates, but not for the refugees and displaced themselves, for all the other actors and the stakeholders, and also an economy for the host community and for the host governments. Which means that actually, and I really insist on clarifying this, because this is the big elephant in the room. We cannot talk about solution before we frame all of this. The ways in which displaced populations I'm going to stick to Lebanon. In Lebanon, and refugees in Lebanon have been weaponized and instrumentalized by governments, by local civil society, by international civil society. They have been used for political purposes to increase political bargaining power, but also as magnets for international funding. And also by actually encouraging and creating tensions, social tensions, where racism, hate speech actually plays out magnificently in a magnificently successful way. So that's another elephant in the room. And the other thing, I have a couple of more points around this, which is the ways in which different stakeholders have actually reproduced vulnerabilities by having international aid targeting male heads of household, by actually reinforcing power structures where, for instance, with the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, the self-appointed male shawish that does everything from deciding who gets aid to marrying little girls to sending women and girls to work in the field, to actually condoning and at least being conducive to sexual violence and gender-based violence amongst refugees and displaced people. And also the making the whatever diversity we have and whatever different gender-based oppression that we have in a normal situation are amplified 100-fold in a displacement situation or in a refugee situation. And so we do have the major taboo of what happens with queer refugees, and what I want to use as an example here is the ways we have, for instance, in Latin America, particular instances where multi-stakeholders work together to protect and support queer refugees in Latin America. The propensity of transactional sex, and we all know how it happens, but we never put our heads together to actually do something about it. So having said this, what is it that, what are the durable solutions that uphold the rights and the dignities of refugees, that recognize the diversity, that recognize the fact that we have been for years and years and decades, we have been reproducing these forms of violence and injustice and inequalities? I have yet to see refugee-centered initiatives. I have yet to see refugees at the heart of engaging with multi-stakeholder setup, including civil society, governments, and private sectors. We have seen also academia as being extractive, as I have said. So, and we know how it can be, how we can move towards interventions that are refugee-centered, which are led by refugees, which links to the second point, which is, if we really want to think about sustainable solutions that strengthen refugee protection, we need to strengthen refugee voices and representations. We do not have, until now, we do not have a proper mechanism, a proper system where we hear the voices of refugees, where all the voices in their diversities that are actually out there, we do not have an agenda, a refugee set agenda or an internally displaced person set agenda. And that for me goes back to what Mariam was saying, that for me represents localization. So sustainable solution by these multi-stakeholders is about localizing these solutions and amplifying representation of refugees and by refugees. So my last comments about refugees as contributors, I want to make a point here that refugees are already contributing to all our societies. They are the cheap labor. They are consumers. They are magnets for international aid, and they are drivers of the economy. They are already contributors. And I think if we want to, the shift here is in quantifying, recognizing these contributions, because they are there. All of our countries, actually, we owe an important chunk of our economy because of the incoming support to the refugees. At a time when refugees rarely have similar access as other people, it's like they belong to another set of rights, and when actually they are at the receiving end of violence and hate speech. And I think to shift this mindset of refugees already contributing and already bringing in resources, we have to go back to the questions that as feminists we always ask, who's benefiting? Who benefits from this? And we are benefiting both politically as we improve our political bargaining power. Our governments inflate numbers on demand. They create narratives on demand, and also profit by, as I said, bringing in financial aid and bringing in support to the country. So I guess in conclusion, what I want to say is, it's not really about creating or discovering a solution. It's about acknowledging the fact that refugees and displaced people are actually contributors in their own rights, that these are diverse communities, that actually there are power relations, and that actually we have been profiting from this situation for a long, long time. Thank you, Elora.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you, Rana, and thank you, Mariam. You've all given us a number of reasons for concern, and you've also given us some insights that suggest hope and ways forward for the future. We've gotten a lot of questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them. But one question that has arisen that I'd love to hear each of your thoughts on is, if you could change one thing about the international response tomorrow, what would it be? Maybe we can start with Rana first, and then go to Mariam, and then go to Lina.
Thank you, Elora. I really like this question, and I saw it in the chat, and I was thinking what I would do. Honestly, a lot of what Mariam said and what Lina said hit home to me, because I'm a humanitarian in the field. I see refugees, I talk to refugees. Somebody asked about the gender dimension. I speak to women and girls, and also men and boys. But if I really wanted to scramble my thoughts to give you a very simple answer, I would say that we have to plan so well from the start. We've all been in this business way too long, and unfortunately, but things, emergency situation turned into a bit of a sleepy situation, turned into a bit of a protracted situation. We've seen so many of these, and I can give lots of examples. It's not a surprise what we need to do at the onset, who we need to work with. It's not just it's a humanitarian crisis, but we also need different actors. We need the development actors, we need the civil society, and Lina mentioned it very well. We need the refugees to be there. So what I'm trying to say is, it's about time that we get it right, that our planning really focuses on who needs to be sitting at the table from the start, and it has to have a very genuine role for the individuals, the forcibly displaced persons themselves from the start. And we have to work towards a very well-structured project with an ethical exit strategy. Because a lot of the protracted situations that we're in is really because at one point in time, and somebody asked it, the finances are gone. And so what do? People still have needs. So all of the lessons learned that we have accumulated over the decades, I think it's about time that we put it in real action, and that the commitment to respond to these humanitarian crises is genuine. It's not just, now it's the Sudan crisis, which unfortunately actually doesn't get as much exposure as it should. Or before it was the Ukraine crisis or the Syria crisis, and then it's forgotten. So I think it's the good planning and it's the genuine planning, and not just because now this is what, the international community wants to financially support. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Rana. Mariam, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, well, actually, this is a very, very good question. But I think that Rana already addressed most of actually everything that can be said of how the international community work could be changed in the international response to the refugee crisis. I just want to add a kind of like moving into a different framework in addressing this question, exactly because Rana has already covered everything. I just want to bring another point. This is what we can change in order to face the situation. But the problem is that we shouldn't forget that there are international responsibility even in making this crisis, this refugee crisis. So there is a political dimension that needs also to be considered, and that probably is the first one that we should change. I know it sounds a little bit probably demagogic in mentioning it in this way, but what I wanted to say is that basically we need to always remember that the international community doesn't only have a responsibility in managing the refugee crisis from a humanitarian perspective in an emergency, when the emergency is already there, but it actually has a responsibility in producing and reproducing the conditions that drive displacement in the first place. And this is something that we need to consider when we try to address the condition of displacement and status of refugees, because otherwise, we keep looking at treating refugees as a problem in a way, or like an issue of aid delivery and self-reliance or reliance for host countries. But actually, durable solutions are not going to be possible without some political solution. So because refugees eventually cannot rebuild their life if conflicts remain unresolved, if we cannot address their rights, from the very beginning in guaranteeing, safety and security in their life. And we are seeing this in our region. We keep having protracted crises that are the result of a legacy of political issue and colonialism and history of conflict that has not been addressed. So I would say that this is also something else that we need to consider, the political dimension that needs to be changed in order to not only address at the roots, the refugee crisis, but also to guarantee that safety and stability can be achieved as durable solutions are being implemented and envisioned and proposed for the refugee population and for the host countries.
Thank you, Mariam. Lena? Lena, I think you're on mute. Would you mind unmuting yourself?
I think just two simple things. One, if we could only learn from decades of everything that has been done wrong, I think for me, that's the most pressing thing. How do we learn from our own research? I mean, when you have a new refugee crisis, and when you decide to give debit cards to the male head of household, you're basically going against all the data that you yourself have collected for decades and decades. when you roll out a program that doesn't have an SRHR component, basically you know very well that women and girls are going to be doubly hurt by this. So if on the one hand, we can just look at the learning from the data that we have already. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, I go back to what I was saying, talking to people and understanding their lived experiences. What does it take to have initiatives that are based on the lived experiences of people? And these lived experiences are diverse. Refugees are not a blob. They're not just one group. So what I would say is change these two ways of working, learning from the past and listening to the people themselves.
Thank you. I'd like to now group two questions together and let anyone who wishes to answer them answer them. The first question is about selective visibility in the refugee context. And the question is, how can we ensure that responsibility sharing is not influenced by selective visibility, especially in the non-signatory contexts like Jordan and Lebanon? And the person asking this question raises, for example, that Iranian refugees remain largely unrepresented in global discourse despite real needs. So that's the first question. And the second question is directed specifically for Mariam. Mariam, can you give a positive example of what happens when local actors, such as municipalities, local NGOs, are given authority and resources to develop programs? So whoever wants to can go first. Lena, I don't know if you want to go first this time. No? Rana, do you want to go first? Okay. And then we'll go to Mariam, and then we'll let Lena wrap this up. We're almost at time.
Thank you. Yes, I saw that question, and I think it's a very valid question, and it speaks to the reality. And I think Lena mentioned it, and Mariam mentioned it. There is a reality that is larger than all of us. There are agendas. We can, as Mariam made a very good point, we can argue about how we can improve the response to refugee situations. But, you know, why is it still happening 75 years later? Why isn't it stopping in the first place? For UNHCR, we're a non-political humanitarian organization. In a situation like this, you know, you all remember all too well the criticism on the media when the Ukraine situation started and how there was this very discriminatory narrative coming out. Some saw it as discriminatory, others didn't see it as discriminatory. These things are going to happen and it's out of our control. This is the media. I mean, we see it and we deal with it in our personal lives and in our professional lives on a daily basis. And with social media, it's amplified. But what we have a responsibility in as whether it's the UN or civil society organizations or the refugees themselves, is to continue to advocate for real responses from the international community. So the Sudan crisis, the Syria situation, the wars in the Middle East, those are all advocacy points that all of us, irrespective of our ranks, have to continue upholding. This is why our High Commissioner right now, who is newly appointed, has, in my opinion, one of the hardest jobs in the world. I think it's very important for all of us, whichever seat at the table we have, to continue to advocate with donors for unearmarked funding, which means donors will just commit to funding to a certain situation and leave it up to the stakeholders on the ground, civil society, NGOs, international NGOs, UN agencies, to prioritize the response. If we don't continue to speak up, then yes, of course, I do think that the media will be able to shine the lens that it wants to. But while they're doing that, and some media outlets, by the way, are super ethical, very objective, and are true humanitarians. And that's why UNHCR, for example, has very good relationships with some of them. But for those who have their own agendas, I think we just need to continue raising our voices, from those that are most senior to those on the ground. And also, same thing with the governments. Many of us have different kinds of meetings. And when you repeat the real needs on the grounds, when you explain it in a way that's understandable to those watching that are not the decision makers, they can also support in influencing the decision makers. So I would say to continue to advocate for a spotlight on all of the situations, including, I think the person who posted this question was talking about the lack of visibility for what's happening in Iran. Over.
Thank you, Rana. Mariam? Mariam, you're on mute.
Sorry, I keep forgetting. So yeah, I was just saying, I'm going to focus on the question that was directed to me on the positive examples that can be provided on the role of local organization. I want to address this question because actually it is exactly from the experience on the ground that ARDD, the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, had in the past few years that we started realizing that localization and let's say empowerment of local organization was fundamental for addressing the needs of the population and for assuring that projects or any kind of development approach can be successful. And the direct experience that I'm referring to is the role that local civil society organization played during the COVID period. So during COVID in Jordan, as in many other places, we were under lockdown and services could not be provided. It was, of course, an emergency shock for everyone, and it was very hard to reorganize, and to make sure that people could access goods, but also that could access services. So the government actually tried at the very beginning to provide services and to address, these issues through a centralized response, where they were trying to reach, different areas of the country and different sectors of the population. However, it was very hard to actually make sure that food, for example, could be delivered, that everyone would have access to this kind of services. Very quickly, it became actually clear that local organization and municipalities, for example, could cooperate in that sense and could take the lead in identifying the families, the areas that were more in need and where these services were not being provided because they could not reach them, and so they started working together in order to assure that all the different kind of needs could be addressed. Why was this successful? It was successful because, especially in these areas, in more isolated areas, this local organization and community-based organization could identify could not only identify the families and the groups that were more in need, but they were also trusted by these people who actually knew already the social workers. They knew the people that were going to communicate with them and that were basically supporting them. So because of this trusted relationship and because of the deep knowledge that these local organizations have of their areas and of their communities, services were being provided, and coordination was established with the national authorities in order to guarantee that refugees, for example, would not be left behind and could actually be reached in order to deliver food, in order to deliver the different kind of assistance that they need. So what is important in this example is that local actors were not only a secondary actor in supporting delivery of services, but they were actually the factor that allowed to identify who was in need and how to reach people in need. So they were very efficient and very accurate in the way they were actually supporting their own community. This is because, as I was saying, they already knew the neighborhood, they knew the communities, they knew the families, and they knew the kind of pressure that these families were living it. They knew the kind of risks. For example, if we want to talk about gender-based violence, okay, this is also a dimension that was very important, because being among the community in such pressure and, you know, in moments of emergency like the COVID, the COVID period, it actually allowed the fact that these organizations were already well established and trusted by the population. It allowed to make assessment of the risks that the women, for example, would face, you know, from this perspective. It was easier, for example, to identify people with disabilities and to facilitate the access to services for and support for people with disabilities that otherwise, in a centralized response, was not possible to provide. So this is one, I think, very important example that actually allowed for the development eventually, first of all, for the creation of a network, because following this experience on the ground during the COVID period, the network of local NGO in Jordan actually, was reinforced, and they started cooperating even more, and they started actually to develop a plan for localization, a project, a vision that should enable localization not just as a concept, but as a practice that can be implemented on the ground and can be actually successful, and that goes beyond just, you know, the statements of wanting to support local organizations.
Thank you so much, Mariam. We're over time now, so I want to turn it over to Lena for brilliant last words. Thank you.
Yes, very, very briefly, I'm aware of time. I just want to say, I want to share with you an amazing example, which not only happened in 2025, it happened in 2024, and it happened after the port explosion in 2020. The first people or let's say amongst the first people who have gathered, organized, and supported were actually the migrant women domestic workers. And again, just to close very quickly, if I were to change anything, or if I were to take a lesson from this, is to support women organizing amongst migrants, amongst refugees, amongst internally displaced. And I would end with that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for participating in today's webinar. It's a pleasure to learn from all three of you. And again, thank you so much to Columbia Global for hosting us today.
Thank you all. Thank you.